In 2011, Sihanoukville was a sleepy port town on the southern coast of Cambodia. Full of small stalls and fishing boats sailing about, it had a lazy atmosphere about it and felt more like a beach town than a city. Now, in 2021, Sihanoukville looks more like this. At a glance, you wouldn't be able to recognize it anymore. With paved boulevards, high-rises, and casinos throughout, Sihanoukville has completely transformed. It seems more like a modern developed city than the sleepy port town it was in 2011. So in just 10 years, what happened that so drastically changed the city? Well, it's actually quite straightforward. It has to do with China, and more concretely, how China increasingly is investing in overseas projects. In Cambodia alone, for each year between 2013 and 2017, China actually invested $1 billion, and that's what we see reflected in Sihanoukville. But this isn't actually an uncommon trend right now. In the global south, China is building completely new cities from scratch, often on reclaimed land, as part of their new foreign policies, since Xi Jinping assumed office in 2013. From Cambodia to Malaysia to Sri Lanka, we'll look at 3 different city projects in this video to understand what they actually signify for these countries and how they shed light on China's overseas aspirations. In 2013, China launched the still ongoing massive, and I mean really massive, global development project known as the Belt and Road Initiative. When completed, this $4 to $8 trillion infrastructure network will be comprised of economic corridors that span some 60 countries and aims to improve both land and sea connections. China has already poured billions of dollars into many South Asian and African countries. Malaysia, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka are just 3 examples of how some countries have had their infrastructures and economies impacted by this, for good or for bad, and how China, in some cases, has constructed completely new city projects from scratch along the Belt and Road network. So, why has China poured so much money into overseas investments? Well, although China hasn't clearly articulated the international strategy of the Belt and Road Initiative, scholars tend to agree that it's part of Xi Jinping's strategy to redirect Chinese foreign policy towards better international ties. They argued that the Belt and Road Initiative has been established as a way for China to connect with resources and markets beyond its borders, and essentially suggested the Belt and Road Initiative is an apparatus for China to extend their geo-economic and geopolitical influence. For example, a lot of the ports, urban outposts, and special economic zones that China are developing overseas currently challenge the local structures of power. They're placed in strategically important locations, and economically speaking, so that China has access to resources and a broader market. Some scholars also highlight China's geocultural aspirations. They argue that China has promoted the Belt and Road Initiative as a revival of the historical Silk Road and has created a narrative that looks back at a golden age of connectivity between Asian states. Probably to improve its international ties, this narrative, which uses quite benevolent terminology, has enabled China to spread and circulate values and ideas that are associated with the Silk Road, or in other words, the cultural fabric that an expansionist state needs overseas as well as at home. In any case, no matter what China's overseas intentions are, there's no question that recipient countries are seeing the effects of it. Like we saw, this is especially obvious in Sihanoukville, where not only the local culture has changed, but the environmental landscape also has undergone a significant transformation. Another example is Forest City in Malaysia, which didn't even exist 10 years ago. Forest City is a privately gated new city that sprung up on a tabula rasa in 2014. It's actually still being developed, but by a private Chinese company, Country Garden Holdings, one of Forbes' 500 biggest companies globally. Quite astoundingly, the city is being constructed entirely on reclaimed land, or in other words, new land created from the ocean. It's meant to house 700,000 people, which will make it one of the 7 biggest cities in Malaysia. However, when we actually take a peek at who's living there, it's pretty much exclusively a Chinese population. Forest City is located within a special economic zone. Confusing, I know, but broadly this means that it has an unprecedented level of sovereignty. In practice, this has led to lower taxation rates and tax holidays for a Chinese population that is seeking real estate and investment opportunities overseas. But importantly, it also means that Malaysian authorities have little to say about what transpires in Forest City. That's important because of its exclusively Chinese population, who could gain the legal right to vote in Malaysia's federal election just after 12 years of residency. They would then have a tangible impact on both the political and cultural landscape of Malaysia in the years to come. While scholars have called this out as a form of neo-colonialism, former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir, has equated the influx of Chinese nationals in Malaysia to the British purchase of Singapore in 1824.
Our objection is because it was built for foreigners, not built for Malaysians.
So it's fair to say that the project is controversial. But that's not all of it, because Forest City is actually located right across from the US ally Singapore in the Malacca Strait. Professor of Cultural and Urban Geography at McGill University, Sarah Moser was the first scholar to notice Forest City, and as she points out, its geopolitical implications.
Forest City is the largest real estate development outside of China, so we can read significance into it based on its location and the fact that if you are a powerful company in China, you probably have ties to the state. But it's at a very important geopolitical location at a key choke point in the Malacca Strait, and that's where the ships pass that are going to the Middle East.
That's important because the Malacca Strait is a major global shipping channel, and the US ally Singapore sits at its eastern opening at a choke point where the strait narrows.
And so it's 1.5 miles wide at the narrowest point, and that's where Forest City is located.
China doesn't have a lot of influence in the Indian Ocean right now, so Beijing anxiously wants to secure trade routes here, maybe in the event of a political conflict where its rivals could cut off oil and gas imports by blocking the strait. Next, we'll go west, where another country is working with China, but in the process, amassing a large debt. The new city project, Port City Colombo, was launched in 2014, and it was built just beside the shipping port of Colombo City. Alongside the former Sri Lankan president, Xi Jinping attended the launch of the city in person, so it's important for China, to say the least. Just like Forest City, Port City Colombo is located in a special economic zone and is built entirely on reclaimed land. It also has quite suggestive geopolitical intentions behind it, being a Chinese-operated port city within India's economic sphere. What's really distinct about the project is how China managed to acquire the right to be here by loaning money to the Sri Lankan government.
I think the new city/port that China's building in Sri Lanka is an example of what scholars have called debt colonialism. So China offered to help construct and finance a new port and this new city project.
In fact, almost 70% of the infrastructure that has been built in the past decade in Sri Lanka has been funded by China.
And the payments were so big that Sri Lanka was unable to make them. So they renegotiated the terms of the agreement, which meant that Sri Lanka basically ceded the port to China for 99 years. So this is a really significant geopolitical move that China's made. So people are speculating, okay, China owns a port now in Sri Lankan territory for 99 years. Are they going to militarize it? Is this going to be a place where they could, have battleships stop, landing strips?
Although it's hard to answer these questions right now, China's geopolitical ambitions become clearer. Port City Colombo reflects how China is using fast urbanism to secure geostrategic locations around the world, and how vulnerable countries such as Sri Lanka are being lured into debt traps in the process. This brings us back to Cambodia, and the drastic transformation of Sihanoukville, which shows how fast Chinese urbanism is impacting local actors and the environment. It's important to mention that Chinese investments in Cambodia have had some positive consequences for locals, like infrastructure developments, increased job opportunities, and in some cases, higher wages and incomes for local workers and businesses. But, as you might imagine, the political, cultural, and environmental landscapes have been impacted more negatively too. Politically speaking, some scholars argue that Chinese investments have fueled corruption in Cambodia, and that the influx of Chinese nationals has led to an increase in cybercrime. There have also been some issues with land grabbing, where local landowners have been displaced for China's commercial purposes. Culturally speaking, Sihanoukville has seen an increase in crime and violence and illegal sex work. The Khmer language has also been deteriorating here, due to Chinese nationals doing business in Sihanoukville quite carelessly, misspelling signs in Khmer. And environmentally, just by looking at Sihanoukville, we can see something is drastically amiss. Whether it be from pollution that China's casinos, power plants, or oil platforms produce, the forests and the biodiversity around Sihanoukville has suffered greatly. Although each of these 3 city projects highlight distinct problems, these problems aren't actually exclusive to that project. All of these projects have to some degree worsened the local environment and have had socio-cultural and economic consequences for the recipient countries. But on the other hand, they also show how Chinese investments have led to infrastructural improvements.
It's a bit controversial how these Chinese projects are impacting state actors, their local environments. In some cases, I think they're injecting investment money that can be used to improve infrastructure. And so a lot of the countries they're targeting are countries where there's been very little infrastructure built in the last, few decades, and they're not getting investment from elsewhere. So like the traditional sources like Europe and the US are not willing to get involved. And so China's coming in and filling this gap. So countries are grateful to have a powerful investor, but it comes with a price tag. And I think we're still discovering what this price tag is. So, people are speculating, what is the nature of the Belt and Road Initiative or this new Silk Road that China's creating?
In any case, be it through the special economic zones, strategic placements, or improved port infrastructure, these 3 ocean-based urban projects all point to how China is challenging the geopolitical structures of power in the global south. China seems to want to expand its overseas influence, and it's doing so through the Belt and Road Initiative, and in turn by improving infrastructures of countries in need. But what we're seeing happening in the process may be cause for concern. We need to question who will take responsibility for the environmental degradation, humanitarian concerns, and the fragmentation of local cultures. Will the host countries, or will China?